Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all, and thank you to those attending this morning's session as well. And we'll be carrying on this afternoon with a really interesting series of speakers, and then followed by a more open-ended sort of discussion. My name is Alex Schwartz. I am Deputy Director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law here at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, where I'm also Assistant Professor. It's a great pleasure for me to be chairing this panel with the sort of people we've managed to get together for it to speak on these topics of young people, policing, and transitional justice. So I won't spend too much time introducing because they have very distinguished CVs, but I'll give a brief intro for our speakers. So we have Professor Eric Chui from the Department of Social and Behavioural Sciences, City University of Hong Kong. He has been managing editor of the Asian Journal of Criminology and series editor of Routledge Studies in Crime and Justice in Asia and the Global South. In addition to authoring numerous academic publications in criminology, Professor Chui has done some of the latest cutting-edge research on youth, I think ongoing research, I should say, on youth activism and radicalization in Hong Kong, which is, of course, very much of interest for our purposes here today, and I believe I'm not alone in sharing that interest here. We also have, very lucky to have Professor Tim Newburn, Professor of Criminology and Social Policy at the London School of Economics, who has very generously, graciously come all the way from London to be with us. He is, I think, without a doubt, one of the world's leading scholars on policing crime and criminal justice, having authored some of the most influential research in the discipline. But in addition to being a star of police studies, Professor Newburn is also a leading scholar of riots, or disorder, unrest, if you will, and it was the lead researcher in an innovative research project in collaboration with the Guardian newspaper on the causes and consequences of the quote-unquote riots that occurred across England in 2011. Also joining us from away, from Belfast, Northern Ireland, is Professor Kieran McEvoy, Professor of Law and Transitional Justice at Queen's University, Belfast, my former institution. Professor McEvoy has played a key role in shaping the development of transitional justice as a field of scholarship over the last 20 years, in addition to having done comparative research in the field covering contexts around the world, such as Colombia, South Africa, Chile, Tunisia, Uruguay, Rwanda. He is also one of the key figures in the scholarship of Northern Ireland's peace process and ongoing efforts in truth recovery and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. So we're very lucky to have Kieran McEvoy joining us from so far away as well. And from less far afield, we are very lucky to have Professor Maggy, our very own, from the Department of Sociology at the University of Hong Kong. She has published extensively in sociology and criminology, contributing to many important policy debates in policing and crime control. In addition, she's the associate editor of Theoretical Criminology, Policing and Society on the International Advisory Board of the Oxford University Press monograph series, Clarendon series in criminology. So as you can see, we have really an excellent group of people here with us today. And so without further delay, I will pass over to Professor Chui. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for your kind introduction. And first of all, I'm very honored to be at University of Hong Kong and to share with you some of the findings that generated from a GRF, a research project that I am at the moment conducting. And I think I feel that this topic is so important, and that's the reason why I would love to share some of the major findings from a larger research project that I think that you will be interested. And of course, as mentioned by Alex, this is an ongoing project because it won't come to an end till 2021. So we still have another 2 years to go. And let me first of all briefly talk about the research team I have, and in fact it's quite a interdisciplinary one. So I've got people from law and politics and psychology, and in fact today my 2 research assistants are with me, and because they have been working very hard to prepare for the PowerPoint slides for me today, because at the moment, while I'm still researching, I'm also holding a full-time position as a Dean of Students at City University of Hong Kong. So you know how tough the life it can be when you have to deal with about 2,000 students and also 4,000 staff members, and each of them have different voices, and how we can draw them together and see a way to move forward. And it's a very difficult task, I'm sure you understand. And in the stuff that I'm going to present to you, in fact, is concerned with two major research questions. Rather than providing you with a very sophisticated theoretical framework of the whole study, and I would rather, put it in the as framed in the research questions, so it's make it more easier for you, some of you as a non-social scientist, to understand. First of all, the keywords will be the patterns of civic engagement. So this is the keyword, and I will define these terms with you one by one. And the second one is about how does this civic engagement among young people relate to the two other key terms, activism and radicalism. So again, there are, in addition to the terminology, civic engagement, I would define also activism and also radicalism, because it means different things across different jurisdictions and different places. So, and I have to say that in Hong Kong, we are building up a large pool of research looking into that. And prior to that, as you know, last year, the crime rate for young people is only about 8,000 arrests a year out of a 7.4 million people. So, but now you can see that the situation has changed quite a lot during these 7 months. Okay, let me briefly define to you the terminology. So the activism here refers to the legal and non-violent political actions with the goal of achieving social and political change. So the key word will be legal and non-violent. Whereas for radicalism, and we define it, again, the main aim is to achieve also social and political change. But however, the means they would choose to achieve this will be different from the way that we define activism. So, because they are using somehow illegal or violent political actions. Okay? So, again, when we try to research on that, we can see that there are different ways of operationalizing these two key terms. And because somehow activism may refer to a number of actions, and I will tell you how do we define which scale we have used in the end in order to capture the essence or the actions of people who are choosing legal and non-violent means to achieve goals. But at the same time also, we are also interested in looking at the actors. Who are the actors? Because for each action itself, there must be a target they would like to turn to. They are not mutually exclusive and depending on the conditions, again. So it is complicated. That's the reason why when we conduct some of the in-depth interviews with the students, the university students, they always say that, which event are you referring to? The conditions for that event last year is different from the event in the next month. So, but as always, all the students will say, in the interest of time, I can only give you 50 minutes and things like that. So how can we capture the complexities of the stories and the experiences of the young people, which is a big challenge to us. Let me define a little bit on civic engagement. I thought that would be quite interesting to see how this terminology has been defined or we call socially constructed, per se, in that way. So these are from the media and that we have got from that. And we finally conclude that in general, when people talk about politically active young people, and in the last few months, you can see that they are being seen as more asocial, right? I'm sure these quotations are not, or newspapers that you read are foreign to you, are new to you at all. And but is that right? Is it the meaning of civic engagement? by using these popular or the media, pre-media's influence on our conceptions. And surely, I think we, instead of relying on the common lay people's perception, so we will turn to some scholars in order to look at the civic engagement in a more detailed way. I'm going to read out maybe maybe the first quotation to you from Maggy. So both conventional political volunteering and protest activism rely on commitment, values, solidarities, and often altruism as ordinary citizens seek solutions to collective problems and issues. So there are a number of key terms here: commitment, values, solidarities, and altruism. So some of the values that holding. But we want to say that our research goes beyond just about political involvement. So we indeed look at the civic engagement, including volunteering and advocacy, or advocating for something. So I'm sure our young people equally are the active agents of advocating for some social change, maybe relating to their ethnic group, maybe related to the groups the religious groups or whatever, equally they can. So our research goes beyond just narrowly defined engagement in the political sense. And but from the literature overseas, as always, you can see that we can see whenever we talk about civic engagement, that associates with a very positive connotation, okay, which is a little bit different from what we have seen. I've shown you from the media about how people's involvement in politics are being defined in that circumstances. So I want to conclude based on the literature we have read. It seems that this is a common perception, is that civic engagement is developmentally advantageous for young people. It is an indicative of a healthy civic society, which is needed for functioning democracies. So you can see that, as I've mentioned to you, while some people see that as very negatively, whenever that associate with politics. But on the other hand, there are people saying that this is also very important. It is a very good indicator of a healthy civic society. And how do we measure civic engagement? And in my study, I have used a Canadian study by Penza, which was conducted in 2007. So as you can see from these PowerPoints, bullet point number 2 here, we captured, of course, political activities. For example, whether they have attended a demonstration. I think we give them a time frame. It should be in the past 12 months. So we didn't ask for a lifetime in participation. Rather than we just asked about in the past 12 months, have you engaged in that with a Likert scale from 1 to 7 and something like that. And then apart from looking at the political activities, we also look at the community activities. As mentioned to you before, we also ask about whether they volunteer or they engage in the community activities. Do they feel that they are part of the community so that they will do something in order to improve the neighborhood in one way or another. And then the third one is about responding activities. So you can see that they are a little bit passive than the first two ones, as you can see. They respond to maybe whenever there's a social media, there's a message, ask to sign a petition. Okay? So have you ever signed a petition in the last 12 months? You respond to a call for some actions and things like that. And the fourth one is about helping activities. So it's, again, that also relate to volunteering, but more about helping people and things like that. So in this case, you can see that one of the bulk of the measurements is a total of 30 items in order to measure the 4 aspects of civic engagement. Okay, and today I'm going to share with you some findings, and the first one is was conducted in 2015 to 17, which is a seed funding from City University of Hong Kong. So it's a very it's a cross-sectional study, And I'm going to present some of the data because we use similar scales that we have conducted in 2015. And then in 2019, which is last year, the January of the 1st, we started the GRF study, which is a panel study. And I will tell you a little bit more about what that's meant by a panel study, because in fact, next month, we are going to trace the same group of people by using the same scale. Then we can definitely will capture what has happened in 7 months in the next round of my study. So if they respond to my call for the wave 2 data, I think it's going to be a challenge. And so I'm going to share with you the Wave 1 survey data. And as if I repeat to you again, the first one I've mentioned to you, the seed funding one. So we conduct the research right after the umbrella movement, so which is about 3 or 4 years ago. Okay, and in 2019 we have, I think it's between, if I remember correctly, it must be between January to May, which is the second term of last academic year. So we have completed the Wave 1 survey, which is collected before the anti-extradition movement, before that. As you can see, that's the reason why don't be so surprised, because as I've mentioned to you about the word conditions. So when did I conduct the research, that affect very much on how do they self-report the participation. Okay, but we are yet to know more about that in Wave 2. As I've mentioned to you, we are using, in fact, the whole scales is about 10 pages, but today I'm going to present to you only about 2 or 3 pages of the finding, because in the interest of time, I think I've got only about 5 to 10 more minutes. But for the measurement I've mentioned to you, there are altogether 30 items on civic engagement by using YII. So we use the infantry developed in Canada by Penzer and colleagues. And in addition to that, we also use another scale, which is about the measurement on activism and radicalism. And the name of the scale is Activism and Radicalism Scale, which was published in 2009. And altogether, there will be about another 15 items for activism and radicalism. And in addition to that, we collect some of the demographic information. And in fact, we haven't got enough time to run more sophisticated data. In fact, we do ask about the parents also the young people's report on their parents, the mother and the father, political participation, because we want to see the intergenerational effect on that. But today, I won't have time to go through that. To give you some sort of ideas of what we have done. So in 2015, you can see that we primarily target on the university students, especially the 8 UGC institutions. And you can see between 2 surveys, the mean is more or less the same, around 21 and 20. Okay, and in fact, we also invite master's students, PhD students, to complete the questionnaire too. So, but you see them, usually they will be the minority in the university. And in terms of gender distribution, you can see more female than males, and I think that is right now is the picture in the university, more females than males. And today we don't have time also to talk about the political identification, because we do ask them which political party they would see themselves being identified with too. So again, I don't have time to go through that. So that is some of the raw data for you to have a look. So we ask them about whether they are pro-democracy, pro-establishment, and things like that. So this is the basic demographic information. And as you can see in 2015 to 16, we have a total of 558, which is a smaller sample. And whereas for 2019 and 2020, we have about 100 students from each 8, for every UGC institution, from the 8 UGC institutions. So we have to travel to Two Moon and Taibo and everywhere. So it's hard work. And before I'm going to summarize the findings, so to tell you, it's technical. So even though we've got 30 items, we've got 4 dimensions. You can see that we are using some of the statistical analysis to help us to classify them into 4 groups. So by using the YII, today I'm going to focus on the YII because one scale is sophisticated enough for me to explain to you how do we come up with that. So because it's fans for the IT, the SPSS, they will be able to help us to calculate and come up with something. And based on the YII, I don't want to use the profile, the word, because, one interesting thing, because we are, apart from using paper and pencil questionnaire that we distribute in the class, in fact, we also have card tricks for people to complete, because nowadays, young people, they are better with their social media. In fact, I received at least 2 or 3 emails and from the students, some of the potential participants. They just say that, are you part of the government who want to collect the information? Why do you ask all this? Do you want to profile the students, even at that point before June, like last year? So you can see that right now, you see research can be very political. Definitely, I can see that. So I have to explain to them and make sure that we've got the ethical approval and the funding is from the government. But I don't think that, we have to report, we have to give the raw data to them as such and things like that. So, which is quite interesting, and somehow we have to explain in word by word. But anyway, in fact, by completing the YII, we can classify people into 4 groups. Number 1, uninvolved group. That means for this group of people, they have the lowest scores of 4 activities. Remember, we talk about political activities, community activities, etc., and helping activities and things like that. For the responder group, they are slightly higher scores on responding and helping activities over the other 2, community and political activities. The helper group have similar pattern shown by responder group, but have a higher overall score. Whereas for the activist group, which is the highest scores in 4 aspects, you will see that this is a continuum. On the one hand, uninvolved group. On the other hand, very activist group. And in between is responder and helper. Okay, so that's help you to visualize it. Let's look at the pattern of these years, because we don't have, we have research, we look at the databases, and so far in Hong Kong, we haven't got any researcher using PANSER's as a study, but we want to use it as a baseline. But before I'm going you to compare this, mind you, I don't want you to compare apples with oranges, because for PANSER's study, definitely, number 1 is conducted in Canada. Number 2, they look at the high school kids only. Okay, but whereas for us, we are using the data, the scales to measure the university students. But from these PPT slide here, you can see that very interesting. You can see for 2015, you can see the majority of them are the responder group. But in 2019, right before the June last year, okay, remember we are asking them. The timing that we interview them or ask them to complete the survey will affect, how much, to what extent they participate. You can see that it was 43% for the uninvolved, and responder group is 33.8, helper group is 19.7, and the activist is 6.3, which is about a slightly drop from the 2015 data. Remember, for the 2015 data, we asked them to complete the questionnaire immediately after the umbrella movement, okay? And obviously, you can compare with the Canadian one, but it's just for reference only. And of course, we are doing more clusters on that. And for this one, you can see that we just want to point out, because my RA just want to point out that the it should be 2019 to 2020 data set, not 2018. You can see that for the responders, you can see that during around January and June last year, the pattern are pretty much the same between 2015. You can see that the activist group, in terms of the four colors of the line, they are the highest score. So that's the reason why they're, and also on the other extreme for the uninvolved, for the four colors, they have the lowest scores. So that's the reason why they are the uninvolved. So, but you can see that for our wave one data, it seems that the young people at that point, they are more likely to be the responders group. And in fact, they are what does it mean? That means they are very responsive to the call for petition and things like that, rather than they actually get involved into the activities. So they are playing the role more as the responders before June last year. And again, we try to, for the following two tables are very complicated, but I will help you. We're going to use a triangle to visualize the findings for you. For this 2015 data set here, so we want to see that there is a strong association between the type of activities they participate with the two dimensions. One is on the activism and radicalism. So I repeat once again. For the YII, we have defined people's participation in various activities, right? And we classify them into four groups: uninvolved groups to activists. At the same time, we want to look at these four groups and to see how does it relate to the terminology, activism and radicalism. So as you can see from this, like for example, let's take the example for the uninvolved. You can see that they have the lowest scores for all these activities, for the four activities. But at the same time, they have the lowest scores for activism by way of measuring intentions. So do they have the intention to be actively involved? Likewise, they have the lowest mean for the radical intention. They've got only 2. So the mean score is 2. For the past activism, you can see that it's only 56.9%. And for the past radicalism, so we measure the behavior, it's only 22.7. When you compare with the activist group, so the far end, you can see that they are scoring very highly for the political activities, community activities, responding activities, and helping activities. Okay? But when you look at also the mean, they also have the highest mean among the four groups. Right? Let's say, for example, the activism intentions is 3.06, compared to the mean for the uninvolved groups is only 2.44. Okay? Look at the past radicalism. You can see 65.3% of our sample within the activist group, they report about they have involved in some radical activities. In fact, when we define radicalism, we talk about whether they are willing to break the law at the expense of achieving social and political goals. Okay? So from here, you can see the strong correlation between the YII, when we mention about the participation in the civic engagement with the concept of activism and radicalism. The same pattern shows in our 2019 data. So I don't think I need to repeat again. Again, those who score very low for the activities, especially the uninvolved groups, the mean score for the activism intentions and radical intentions, etc., they are the lowest among four groups. So from here, to help you to understand, to make it easier for you, is through this pyramid. I think the more that they escalate up in terms of the involvement in civic engagement, according to YII, the more likely they report a higher activism intentions, and also the more likely they reported a history of past activism. Likewise, I don't think I need to explain further for that, is on radicalism. So this is a very interesting point. So in there are a lot of common understanding that activism and radicalism are mutually exclusive. But our study shows it is not the case. So in fact, activism and radicalism are also highly correlated. And by showing this correlation coefficient to you, so you can see that both in 2015 and 2019 data. Activism and radicalism, in terms of intentions and behavior, they are correlated. So again, that poses quite a lot of challenges to some of the common perception that you are either activists or you are radicalists. So the line between two from our studies shows that among the young people are much more blurred than we think. Again, why and how, that will be some point of time that I will share with you. But let me conclude. Through the brief introduction to you, I hope I try to make it clear, make it make it easy for you to understand, because it's technical when you look at the scales that we are dealing with. Number one, I just want to to read out loud, because this is the conclusion that the team want me to read, which is the most safer way to present. Okay, so participation in social movements and protests is invaluable for intrapersonal, social, and society. It should not be discouraged by state institutions, because as we can see that activism and and radicalism are correlated mostly. So as it serves as a channel by which civil society can better communicate their grievances to the state. So that is one way for them to express their concern to the authorities. And that's one way how we can seek the common good in order to move the society forward. And also, you can see some young people, they would like to play the role as an active agent. Unlike in the old days, I have to say that we are rather passive in many, many ways. The second one, you can see that the uninvolved and the responder and helper and active and host across time. So, and I will illustrate to you next PowerPoint slides, and then the timing is so important. As I've mentioned to you, we ask specific timing. Instead of asking about the lifetime participation. Okay. The last but not least is the four group of typologies corresponds to future intentions and past behaviors with regards to activism and radicalism. So this is the theory that we want to build. So it's complicated, but I'm yet to. I won't have time to go through this, because that is the next step, that we run more sophisticated analysis at the same time by bringing in more variables that we have collected. And the reason why we're putting down why and how, because at the moment we are conducting in-depth interviews, which is the part, the first part, the interview subsequent to those people who put down their details. In fact, there's quite a number of young people put down their details. They would like us to interview them one by one. And the reason why, last but not, this is the last one, is about 2020. So right now, while I don't have the answer as a researcher, I hope I get the answer, because in February, we are going to contact the 797 students who completed the survey, see whether they would, we give them incentives, of course. And, but I'm not too sure, because money is not the key thing for them, definitely, because in fact, when we invite them to join the first wave of the survey, we put them a lot of prizes, and only one person come back to us, and we can save the money for the next round, so which is good. So again, for 2020, we are yet to know the answers. I think the pattern will change across time, definitely. All right, I think that's all I want to say. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
I'll welcome Professor Newburn to the podium, please. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real honour to be here, and I would like to start, if I may, by extending very warm thanks to the Dean, to Professor Yap, and particularly to Alex here, who's been our host. Well, who invited us and has been our host for the last couple of days. And as I say, it's a real honour to be here. I, as Alex said in the introduction, in the very generous, overly generous introduction, was involved in some research 9 years ago now on the what are generally referred to as the England riots. And I'm going to make just a few observations out of that research. I'm not going to claim in any way that what happened there and what we found and what we think about it is necessarily of any relevance to what's happening here. It may be, but that's for you to judge, and certainly not something I'm going to claim. I want to do just 2 or 3 things, really, which is just to tell you a little bit about the research itself, because it was an unusual study. And then I want just to pick out 2 or 3 elements from it which speak to the title of this afternoon's session, so particularly around policing and young people. And then I want to come back, I want to conclude just with a reflection about how we sometimes, I think of these things as whether it's riots or it's civic disorder or civil unrest and so forth, but the way in which sometimes terminology, I think, can be very unhelpful in the ways in which these things are framed and therefore are understood. So just to give you a tiny bit of background for those who, there's no reason why you should know any of this, but the riots, which lasted 4 days, only 4 days, so there's a first very big difference. I understand from the huge amount I've learned already today, it's just slightly longer here. 4 days only, but they were by any standard, it was the largest civic unrest in England, certainly in the post-war period. So this was something which began with the shooting of a young black man by London's police. And then, as happens with these things, a series of claims and counterclaims about what had happened and who he was and so forth. Then a march and gradually emerging disorder, which I will come back to momentarily in terms of how we understand those things. Initially in North London, near where the shooting took place, then across the capital city, then outside London, and then it stopped. In that 4 days, 5 people were killed, hundreds of people were injured, tens of millions of pounds worth of buildings and property were destroyed or damaged. In the course of not just the 4 days, but then the period after, and that is the thing I want to come back to at the end, over 4,000 people were arrested, a sufficient number of people were jailed to produce a spike in what is anyway a huge prison population in England and Wales. So we are talking huge and very significant events here, events which blindsided politicians, which, as I'll come to, the police, I think, were in some ways unprepared for, or certainly were seen by some probably to deal with less than ideally. So extraordinary events. The next thing then in the context here is, and as happens in all these kinds of occasions where there's public disorder, a series of claims and counterclaims are then made about what is happening and how it should be understood. What happened in England was quite quickly a political narrative emerged which did many of the usual things, which was to seek to essentially to avoid any debate, any established, the possibility of any narrative becoming established around social, political, and economic causes of disorder, and to portray it more as anarchy or crime or immorality and so forth. So fairly standard, I think, reactions. There was resistance to the idea of an inquiry. So maybe there are some parallels, and voices of various forms became quite loud. So our political leaders were very visible with their claims. In due course, the police elite and criminal justice elite were quite noisy in terms of the claims that they were making about both what had happened and how it should be understood and how they had responded to these things. And then the communities themselves, to a degree, were given some opportunity to talk about their experiences. In the midst of this, there seemed to us, in various ways, and I'll explain the us momentarily, a kind of absence. And the absence, the voice that was missing was the voice of the people on the streets. Why would this thing occur? What would take so many people, 15,000 at one stage, out on the streets to loot, to burn, to do all the things that were occurring? So a study was set up, and let me say just a few words about it. The study was called Reading the Riots. It's an unusual piece. It was a collaboration between my university, the LSE, and our major sort of slightly left of centre broadsheet newspaper, The Guardian newspaper. They'd been at the forefront of reporting the riots, and rang me. We essentially formed a partnership and did a piece of research, the aim of which was, in its first phase, and it was initially intended it would only have one phase, was to give voice to this missing piece of the jigsaw, to seek to speak to and understand the experience of those who were out on the streets. What we wanted to do was to try to be part of the political debate, the political discourse. So the crucial thing, it seemed to us, was to move swiftly, to not do the things that we're so good at doing as academics, which was sitting around for a very long time debating how we were going to do research and so forth. So, in short order, we raised money, we designed research, we recruited people from local communities to act as an interviewing team for us. We produced an analytical team. We sent people out onto the streets to do interviews. They interviewed 270 people who were involved in the violence and hadn't been arrested. Analysed the data, and then published it all in the newspaper over the course of 6 days. And that process, from beginning to end, took about 16 weeks. So it was a 4-month piece of research from beginning to end, using standard social science to do interviews of between 40 minutes to an hour and a quarter with the 270 people. And so the things that I'll talk about now, in some ways come out of those interviews, but also some of the other observations from other bits of the research that we did. So, perhaps the first thing then to say about the unrest was that the strongest, most obvious indicator, the thing that predicts, if you like, why the riots occurred where they did, not why they occurred, was social deprivation. That these were riots that were found in the main in those cities and those parts of those cities that were the poorest and the most deprived. And I'll come back to issues briefly of poverty and marginalisation in a minute. But what we heard when we talked to young people was a very complex set of stories and motivations and explanations and no doubt justifications for what they did. But throughout these interviews, throughout the stories and experiences that they shared, the commonest thing that came up in all the cities in which we talked was their relationship with the police. So the police were absolutely at the core of the narrative of what people felt or told us they felt, they had in their minds, and were in some way expressing and articulating when they were out on the streets. Now, I've got a couple of pictures on this slide. And what the pictures capture is something of a conundrum for researchers, I think, and one which is almost inescapable. Perhaps we'll come back in discussion at some stage to research in the context of civil unrest and how one does it and how it's received and relations with government and so forth. What we found was that it seemed absolutely the case in all the cities and in all the communities in which the riots happened. The people who were involved talked about historically poor relationships with the police, that going back years, going back decades in many cases, these neighbourhoods and these communities had relationships with the police as an institution that was problematic. So on that, as it were, collective level and neighbourhood level, This was a major issue and an historic one. But then more particularly and individually, they talked about their personal relationships with the police. That actually it was what they perceived to be as the day-to-day harassment, the day-to-day repression by the police, which was the way in which they would have described it, was the source of their, as it were, emotional engagement with these things that was going on, the source of much of their anger. Now, in producing the research and talking about the research, there is much more besides to talk about, and the young people, as I say, had these complex and often quite nuanced stories to tell. We managed, so on the left-hand side of the slide there is the front page of the newspaper on the first day of publication of the research. Research which we'd spent only 4 months, but 4 months of hard graft trying to produce a careful, nuanced piece of social science. And indeed, I'd like to claim that this is the only front page of The Guardian I've ever seen that actually has bullet points on it. I mean, that's how social scientific-y it was, okay? So we do all this. I go to bed at night, get up early in the morning because we've got wall-to-wall media interviews for the next 2 days, because this is huge at this stage. And what do I find? I find that, because they'd given no thought to this, that a sub-editor had slapped a headline on it which said, "Blame the police, why the rioters say they took part." And as it were, all the hard work of producing a nuanced story disappeared. And what do we get? And then we get a response later on, a response from the newspapers at the top, our Daily Mail, a response from the then Home Secretary, subsequently Prime Minister Theresa May, accusing us of being apologists for the mob. So, anyway, maybe we'll come back to some of the issues of research and its relationship with policing. But before I leave policing, beyond the issues of how this fed into, at least in part, the reasons and the motivations and the kind of understandings of young people in particular who found themselves out on the streets, there are a series of other things to say about the policing of the unrest. The first of which, and I think is a sort of, just in a sense, a crude but transferable lesson from unrest anywhere, is that the nature of the police response to these things is often crucial in understanding the nature and the shape of the events, which is to say, policing, which is horribly problematic in these circumstances, yes, just very difficult things to police, riots or civil unrest or whatever else it may be, is something which can, of course, mitigate violence, but can also exacerbate it. Get the policing wrong, and what happens? The unrest continues. The unrest gets worse. The unrest morphs into something else. So I'm hoping this sounds possibly familiar in some kinds of ways, but it was certainly true on the streets of London. Even though we're only talking 4 days there, the nature of the police response was such in some circumstances, I think, that it had the unintended effects. It had the reverse effect of what had been hoped by the police commanders, which is the mitigation of violence, and actually it produced an adverse reaction in a variety of ways. Now, that leads to all sorts of questions about what kind of police response should there be, and perhaps we can come back to some of that in discussion. The interesting thing in the case in England was that the particular challenge faced by the police there was, as it were, working within the confines of police ideology and police history in England, as well as the challenges of practice on the ground. So there's an established ideological set of tropes around policing in England which talks about policing by consent. The idea that, a neat conceit, that English policing is done with the support of the public. I mean, it's an interesting notion, but it underpins much of the way in which the police see themselves, as does the idea of the minimal use of force. So the ideological presentation of English policing is that it is something which will always use the minimum amount of force necessary to secure the ends that the police are endeavouring to pursue at that point. In the background, however, in this case, there had been previous unrest in England, smaller scale student protests and riots. There'd been the Occupy movement in London, a variety of things, which on several occasions had gone quite badly wrong, with very significant criticism of the police. The outcome of which was, I think, in the case of this unrest, interestingly, what happened was that the police felt very unsure about how much force that they could use, and actually took a series of practical decisions to scale back their responses initially, leading both, I think, on the one hand, to an awful lot of political criticism of the police, but also probably some of those unintended consequences that I was talking about earlier. In terms of the lessons of these things, well, we will, I think, perhaps again, I think Maggy may want to pick up on one of the two of these things, but in terms of what's been learnt by the policing of the riots, we've not had further unrest in England in the 9 years since on any kind of scale like this. So we're yet to see, as it were, what lessons have been learned and what the new forms, if any, of policing will be. But my suspicion is that one of the likely outcomes is that a much more robust form of policing is the more likely response to future disorder. Quickly on young people. So we heard this morning, in terms of the umbrella movement, in terms of the protests in Hong Kong last year, that somewhere between, let's say, roughly 60%, 40 to 60% of those participating were aged 29 or under. This would be pretty typical, I think, of most civil unrest, of most riots, and so forth. Certainly the case in England, where the only real data that we have to make any sense of these with any accuracy is arrest data. But as it were, luckily, so many people were arrested, we've got quite a lot of data. We can't necessarily claim that these were entirely typical or representative of those who were, for a variety of reasons, who were actually out on the streets, but it's probably a rough indicator. And here we're talking about probably somewhere between 70 and 75% of those who are involved would have been in that age bracket of 30 or younger. But there is nonetheless still quite a spectrum of people involved. That still leaves 30% of people who are aged over 30, I think, which is not your kind of typical or prototypical image, I think, model of, as it were, what a rioter looks like. The second thing to say, which is typical of these things, is, and I was alluding to this before, the very quick and, I think, predictable political reaction to the unrest was to demonize the young. Indeed, it's a standard reaction to criminality generally, is to demonize children, to demonize teenagers, to demonize youth. And the ways in which that played out in England was first of all, as I was saying before, to dismiss what was going on as, and the quote, the Prime Minister's quote at the time was criminality pure and simple. The kind of thing that one might, I think, fairly regularly hear from politicians under these circumstances. The second was to claim that this was all the work of gangs. So, well, the simple use of the word gangs allows one first to suggest that this was organized and planned, and that therefore it was all about young people, when clearly it wasn't. And we know, and there is strong empirical evidence in this particular case, that gangs were not involved. But demonization generally was the political reaction to the unrest. The young people themselves, what are we talking about here? What we saw and what we heard is a section of our population, of our young people, who, as I was saying before, were... I'm just checking the time. Is that where we're at? Almost five. I just saw the one, and I was like, okay. That would be typical of me, but anyway, so we're good. I got 5. Young people who came from, as I was saying, our most marginalized communities. These were poor, failing at school, young people who had, by any objective standard, in fact, relatively poor futures, to put it, I think, mildly, but who saw themselves as people with no future. A kind of punk rock generation, if you like, but post-punk. With no future, living in a world in which they felt they and their neighborhoods were the deliberate target of, not their word, but neoliberal political projects. That is the kind of the evacuation of their communities of resources and agency and so forth, and a future for them in which there was no or little or no prospect of real work, and only a future in which things were going to get worse. So these were angry young people. Angry, though, not just at the police. On one of the previous slides there about the police, I said, but didn't refer to when I was talking, that policing often becomes, I think, a condensation symbol for other things. So the anger at the police is both real and also condenses other emotions and other things. And in this case, some of it was anger towards other elites. And in particular, of interest to me, young people were quite highly politicized. Even though I don't think the unrest in England had particularly strong political motivations in any kind of way. It wasn't a project or a program. It wasn't organized. People didn't talk about it in that kind of way, and yet nonetheless the young people who were engaged with this were politically articulate. And understood their position and articulated their anger as being directed not just towards the police, but towards politicians, towards business leaders. This is post-crash and so forth. So it was quite a widespread sense of dissent. So two final things I'd like to say. So back to the issue of comparativism. As I said, I wanted to make no claims at all that there was necessarily any reason that one should look at England when thinking about what's happening here. But clearly some people have, as the Daily Mail headline there makes clear. I read this, the headline, Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam says she will use the lessons learned from 2011's Tottenham riots in London to try and bring peace to her city. Now, this confuses me somewhat. It confuses me on a number of levels, but straightforwardly it confuses me because I cannot imagine why anyone would think Tottenham was a place from which you would learn lessons about peace. Okay, I mean, it is true to say, as I said, we have not had further unrest in the 9 years since. But that is not, I think, for lack of trying. These places and these neighborhoods would not be described as peaceful places, and the young people who were involved in the unrest of 2011 would not be described as happier or better off or less disenchanted and so forth. By any measure, things have got worse. Moreover, how would one know? The reality of the London unrest or the England unrest is that there seems to be a consensus that the policing of the riots was highly problematic and not terribly successful, and yet you will know that the Independent Police Complaints Council, if I have the phrase right, here in Hong Kong, appointed briefly, they gave up after a while, a commission to come and advise on policing, headed by the previous Chief Inspector of Constabulary in England, Sir Dennis O'Connor. So there's obviously a sense, a post-colonial sense, there's a sense in which lessons can be learnt from England, but the policing one strikes me as odd. But then the wider issue is we cannot know really what worked because we had, and I'm not going to say much about this, I think Maggie will want to pick it up. We didn't really have official inquiries. We didn't have the fully fledged independent commission or judicial inquiry or so forth that might help you make sense of and provide some broadly perceived to be legitimate narrative about what happened and how we should understand it, and what lessons one might draw. So a strange choice. So with my final minute, social science and these things. So the term riot is a deeply problematic one. Scholars like Charles Tilly and a variety of others simply won't use it because it's an inevitably politically freighted term and best avoided. Okay, so there is another reason beyond, as it were, the political freighting of riot, why it's problematic, I think. Riot, and to put it crudely, the term riot is associated with violence. And so what preoccupies social scientists is violence. And what preoccupies, indeed, even us in reading the riots, what preoccupies social scientists is the question of why. These are unusual, sporadic, unpredictable events, and often they're terrifying in their moment and so forth. So we want to know why. We want to try to understand why. But actually those questions are very difficult, if not impossible, to answer. Yeah, much better to think about conditions than causes in many ways. But the preoccupation with violence has another problem, which is to say that once the violence stops, a lot of the time social scientists switch off. So the literature in this field is replete with, from the 1960s onwards, is replete with material about the causes of riots. And then we stop thinking. We stop thinking about how they spread. We stop thinking about how they disperse. We know next to nothing about how they stop. Is it the police? Is it the rain? What might it be? But really crucially, and this seems like, and my final point, this seems like the really odd thing in a criminological world, and I'm a sort of sociologist jobbing as a criminologist, is what about the aftermath? What about riots don't stop for people who live in the communities? Yes, the riots go on for years in terms of their consequences, not just for those who are caught up in the penal apparatus and so forth, but those for whom their businesses, their livelihoods, their homes have been destroyed, their future has been changed, and so forth. So what is absolutely vital, I think, is a reorientation, which says what actually we have to spend much more time upon is thinking about, as it were, the life cycle, the aftermath, the afterlife of protest and unrest and riot. For that actually is probably much more important than the questions in many ways that have otherwise preoccupied us. And I've run slightly over, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Newburn. I'll welcome Professor McEvoy to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Before I start, I should say, so obviously I'm Irish, and when Irish people start to talk about politics, we tend to speak even faster than usual. And so if someone around the front row, if I start to go too fast, when I get a bit excited, you just kind of slow me down, because I think you guys are all very polite, and you probably wouldn't tell me that you actually weren't understanding a word I was saying. I also want to give my thanks to Alex and his colleagues. They've been brilliant hosts. It's been fascinating. I mean, it's my first time in Hong Kong. I really like this place. I mean, I like a place where if you're from Belfast, the politics is in your face, and the politics is in your face here, and it kind of, it resonates for me. I like it. As Alex said, I'm a professor of law and transitional justice. Transitional justice it's kind of a sexy thing now. We take ourselves very seriously. We have our own UN Special Rapporteur, and we have our own journals. We have a couple of book series. We have all the accoutrements of intellectual respectability. And there's always a danger with that, that a wee bit of arrogance might creep in. And so I hope you guys will keep me modest on this. Alex has asked me to talk basically about, I think, truth, amnesties, and I've also squeezed in, I'm going to say something about apologies towards the end as well. But that first caution at the top is very important. Please, I mean, you guys, I'm sure you've had a lot of, inverted commas, experts coming through, doling out advice. And I think you have to choose yourself what's relevant or not from our context. I'm going to talk about a couple of also public order related mechanisms that were created to deal with public order, iconic moments in the history of Northern Ireland. And they've involved essentially the intersection between truth recovery, amnesties, and apologies also became very important, particularly in the context of Bloody Sunday. But that health warning about, I mean, even I've been guilty of it myself. So I think I've worked in maybe 10 or 12 different countries, and I've been leading a little team of nerds, fellow nerds like myself, trying to help the legacy process in Northern Ireland. So we're giving out advice. Now the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. We are just now, literally just now, introducing legislation to deal with the past, 22 years on. So the idea that we would go around being experts and doling out advice, and inevitably, when you've done a lot of international stuff, it frames your way of thinking. And we realised at one stage we were feeding into the negotiations around this stuff, and inevitably we're using our international experience, and you're saying, well, in South Africa they did this, and in Chile they did this, and we were getting no traction at all with the unionist negotiators, because they're very suspicious of foreigners, really, but they're very suspicious of certain foreign knowledge. And so I phoned my friend I was working on this, and I said, we're totally, this is like 12:30 at night, I got her up, I said, I've got an idea here, I've got an idea how we frame this knowledge. We have to make it as British as Finchley. As British as Finchley. Margaret Thatcher famously described Northern Ireland as British as Finchley. And my friend said, go to sleep and call me in the morning, please. So next morning I called her. And in fact what I had to do was we had been trying to frame this conversation around amnesties, immunity from prosecution and so forth as transitional justice knowledge. But actually once you go back and you say, there was a public inquiry into a train that crashed in the 1920s or a boat that sank. This is an established element of British public law. And we got a lot more traction essentially with her, and so I'll talk about that intersection. So there's a big literature. I've been writing a book for about 10 years. It's called The Trouble with Truth. My wife now calls it The Trouble with Truth because it's been around our house for a decade. But anyway, and there's a big literature, as you can imagine, on notions of truth. Broadly, certainly in the design of truth commissions, there have been about 50 truth commissions now internationally. The different styles of truth that emerge in that literature are, first of all, forensic truth, what happened, establishing the facts. Secondly, personal or familial truths, what happened to me, what happened to my family. And sometimes that's captured via oral history, for example, and we have an oral history mechanism as part of our legacy. And then the broader social and political versions of truth, what happened to our society, what were the causes of the conflict or violence, what was the context, and what were the consequences, right? So the bigger truth, the bigger social and political truth. And inevitably, if you're trying to get to that truth, you're going to bump into this question, well, what do we do with perpetrators? If we're going to encourage people to come forward who've been involved in illegal activities, involved in violence, either state or non-state actors, there's going to be some trade-off, because no one's going to want to implicate themselves, obviously. So there has to be, it inevitably takes you to that conversation around amnesties or immunity from prosecution. And I'm not naive on this, by the way, so I think, I'm not a postmodernist either, so somewhere in the middle. But I think what you do with this discussion around truth is what you're really trying to do. When you put all of these versions together, what you're really trying to do is to, as Meg Lignadia famously described it, you're trying to narrow the space for permissible lies. That's about as ambitious as it gets. Being able to nail down things that are just lies. And that's not super ambitious, but I think that's probably realizable. In designing a truth recovery mechanism, any kind of commission of inquiry, I mean, this is all very basic stuff, and this is, as I say, myself and my little team of nerds have been working for a number of years on this design stuff in Northern Ireland. So the more independent from the state any kind of mechanism is, the better. Independent from the state, and also in our context, from non-state actors, from people who've previously been involved in non-state armed groups. Independence is central. So you need to appoint people with public credibility, who are independent and clearly independent-minded. We've gone back and forward a lot on this, whether or not it needs to be international people or local people or a mixture of both, and actually both can work. The legal powers, obviously, that any such mechanism has are extremely important. Whether or not you can compel witnesses to attend, whether or not the mechanism will have access to documents. We've in our explorations of this in Northern Ireland, One of the 4 mechanisms that we're creating, we like to complicate things in Ireland. We don't just have one truth commission, we have 4 intersecting mechanisms. But anyway, one of those is a police-led mechanism, a cold case review style mechanism. But a big issue has been, how much are they going to get access to the intelligence files? Are they going to get access right down, drilling into that? What are the legal powers of the mechanism? And in our case, that mechanism will have access to everything, including intelligence files. Now, then it becomes an issue of, well, what information goes forward to a family? Because you'll have to extract some of the intelligence files, and there are ways around that. But anyway, the more powerful the legal powers are of any of these mechanisms, the more the public credibility. As I say, I'll come back to this in a moment. You're going to engage inevitably in issues around amnesty or limited immunity. The naming of names, whether or not people who have been involved in, this was a big issue in South Africa, the naming of people who've been involved. In our case, names will not be named. Individuals will not be named, not least because you have responsibilities under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights and the right to life, and if people's lives might be put at risk by it being known publicly that they were involved in acts of violence, then the state can't be complicit in that. So we'll be extracting the names from our process. Are the hearings going to be in public or in private? What are the issues around transparency? If you're dealing with intelligence stuff, then that's going to be in camera. But otherwise, the assumption should be that these things should be held in public. If it's meant to be a society engaging with its past, the more public facing, the better. And then, of course, what happens to the report? In a number of instances, arguably in South Africa, certainly in Sierra Leone, the report that's produced by these gathers dust. So commissioners now who sit on truth commissions, part of the planning process will be, how are you going to implement our recommendations? And a lot of the negotiations, I've interviewed quite a lot of commissioners over the years, will be, before the commissioner agrees to do it, they'll say, I want to be clear what you're going to do with our recommendations. What's the implementation plan before I commit to putting my 5 or 10 years of my life into this work? I want to be sure what you're going to do with it, not just produce a report that gathers dust. So amnesties, what are amnesties? Well, again, there's a lot written on this, but basically an amnesty is a negation of criminal liability and sometimes civil liability as well, for either particular offences or for particular categories of offenders. Historically, amnesties are still very popular. We have a database that my colleague Louise Malander put together. There are 500 amnesties in the world since 1945. There's an average of about 10 to 12 a year still. So they're still a very popular post-conflict tool, if you like. Amnesties used to be a blanket amnesty, so the last thing the outgoing dictator in Latin America would do is sign an amnesty. I hereby indemnify every loyal toenail puller and torturer for everything they've done in defence of the state against whatever. And so that would be the last act. Those kind of blanket amnesties are now unlawful under international law. So amnesties can be used, but they're usually conditional. They're attached to something, e.g. like truth recovery. So the Cameron Commission is one I've decided to have a look at. So the Cameron Commission was a commission that was established by the then Northern Ireland government in 1969 to look into a prolonged period of social unrest. We had prolonged riots, essentially, for, I think, probably about 6 to 9 months. They were associated with the civil rights movement, and what would happen in the civil rights movement, were campaigning for civil and human rights. There would be counter-demonstrations, often led by leading loyalists, including the Reverend Ian Paisley, and the police would be in the mix, but often actually joining in with the loyalist counter-demonstrations. And so you had a mixture of public order, a focus on this particular commission, but also looking at the underlying causes of what had happened, and the underlying causes were political discrimination against Catholics in all aspects of social and political life. And so Cameron takes a fairly broad view. He's a Scottish judge, but he takes a broad view, essentially, of what has gone on, what has caused these riots. The report itself is very critical of the actions of the police. It calls their actions inept, using uncontrolled violence, lacking professionalism, and being engaged in discriminatory practices towards Catholics. So technically, it's quite an effective inquiry, but the politics aren't right at the time. So it doesn't resolve the political issues because the politics aren't right. In fact, the conflict becomes much worse after that. So I suppose this is one inquiry where it's showing the limitations of an inquiry. Because if the politics aren't right, if things are going in a particular direction politically, even if you have a decent judge or you have a decent independent person and they do their best they can, even with that, if the politics aren't right, it isn't going to make the difference. Cameron's work was framed within a broad amnesty. The amnesty was introduced by the Northern Ireland government. It covered all of the protesters, the counter-demonstrators, and the police. And in fact, looking back, I went back to prep for this, and I went back and had a look at it, and it's clear that within the Northern Ireland Cabinet at the time, it's the police in particular that they want to benefit. That's the government are pro this amnesty because they know the police have been involved in seriously illegal activities in terms of how they've gone about this. So that's what was driving, and it was an unconditional amnesty. It wasn't attached to anything at all. It was just an amnesty introduced by the government. So another iconic public order issue in the Northern Ireland context is Bloody Sunday, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. So it's a civil rights march through the city of Derry. It's technically illegal. You had to apply to the Minister for Home Affairs, who's a very reactionary Minister of Home Affairs, so he never allowed any marches to go legal. But for years, the illegality of the march was used as justification for what happened. So the British Army have been deployed in Northern Ireland by this context because the police can't control the public order situation. But the problem about deploying the British Army is that they see this primarily through a colonial lens. So it's the same troops who've been deployed in Cyprus and in Aden and Kenya, and they essentially see this as a colonial uprising, and that's how they're involved supposedly in supporting the police. And famously, they in Derry in 1971 they shoot dead 13 unarmed civilians, and there's also 13 injured. So and the army run amok. Now immediately after that event, a public inquiry is established under Lord Widgery. I think he was the Lord Chief Justice probably in 71. But anyway, and it's a whitewash. Essentially, it reports extremely fast. It has come out in the public record since that the then Prime Minister, Ted Heath, sits down with him before the inquiry and essentially says, your job is to protect the army here. And so it does. It exonerates the army and blames the victims. It basically blames the victims for what happened to them. And so for the families affected by Bloody Sunday, they've had the double whammy, number one, of the events itself, of the killings of their relatives, but then secondly, that the relatives are actually blamed for their own death. I mean, so it becomes an additional injury. And it's a running sore in the Irish, so if you read, I've done a lot of work on ex-combatants over the years, and if you read the biographies or autobiographies of people who joined the IRA. A lot of them joined the IRA precisely because of Bloody Sunday. It's a seminal moment in terms of radicalising the Catholic population. So eventually, as part of the peace negotiations, Tony Blair sets up a second inquiry chaired by Lord Savile. Now, it takes 10 years. To run. It's very expensive. And partially that was a design issue, partially it was the Ministry of Defence fighting tooth and nail to make it as expensive and difficult as they possibly could. They insisted on the whole inquiry going to London at one stage. The whole thing cost 200 million. It was very high tech. I mean, it was really because they had every single person in the inquiry would have had a laptop in front of them with screens, with all of the angles from shooters. It was a very, very serious piece of work. I mean, so it overturns the Widgery inquiry and exonerates the protesters, and it placed responsibility firmly on the soldiers who fired indiscriminately without justification and then lied about it. So Savile says all of that. So even though it is a very lengthy, very expensive process, could have been done much cheaper, it's an excellent piece of work. It's a fabulous inquiry. It really it delivers. The limited immunity, the amnesty immunity bit of that, essentially was a limited form of immunity where any written or oral evidence given by a witness could not be used against them. It could be used against others, however, and it was simply in a letter published from the Attorney General, so it was kind of low-key bit of the proceedings. But it was certainly, everybody recognised it was necessary to encourage testimony. It didn't outlaw, so it's not an amnesty because it doesn't negate criminal liability. And indeed, if you follow the news in the UK, one soldier, Soldier F, who was involved in this, is currently before the courts charged with one murder. In fact, according to the inquiry, he killed 5 people, but he's charged with one murder. But the challenge in that case, if you're the defence, will be if you can show a dotted line going back to the inquiry in terms of how did the police get the evidence? Why you put a detective in the box? That's what you're going to do. I think that they'll struggle to make that charge stick. I think, to be honest, with Soldier F. But also, really importantly, in terms of the Bloody Sunday process, is that David Cameron's early on in David Cameron's tenure as Prime Minister, he delivers. So the report has been commissioned by Parliament, and so he delivers an apology, a very good apology. I'm doing a separate project on apologies, but this counts as a good apology. And so the conclusions of this report are absolutely clear. There is no doubt, there is nothing equivocal, there are no ambiguities. What happened on Bloody Sunday was both unjustified and unjustifiable. It was wrong. The government is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the armed forces, and for that, on behalf of the government and indeed on behalf of our country, I am deeply sorry. Now, Cameron that's a very powerful moment in Irish history, actually. So, and it's carefully choreographed. So the the Parliament is broadcast live in the city of Derry, where the events took place, and the families have been given an advance copy of the report, and they're inside the Guildhall in Derry. It's a beautiful old building, and outside that large screen is there, and the families aren't allowed to tell the crowd what they've seen, because it's embargoed until it arrives in Parliament. But one guy manages to get his finger out through the window, through the security group, and does like this to the crowd. So the crowd, there's thousands of people, and the crowd all know that that basically the families have been exonerated. But the apology itself becomes part of the truth recovery process. It's not an alternative to truth recovery, but I've interviewed a lot of the families of Bloody Sunday, and the apology itself becomes a very, very important aspect of this process. And so we've been doing another broader piece of work, and I'll finish up on this, about seeing, well, what does an apology, how do you do apologies effectively? And I stress again, apologies are not an alternative to justice or to truth recovery, but they can be part of a bigger package, essentially. And so I've just finished a piece of work you can see it on the UN Special Rapporteur's website, on how you do effective apologies in post-conflict or authoritarian societies. Here are the kind of things that you should be thinking about, and all of these are actually present in Cameron's apology. So a recognition of a hurt that is deliberately or negligently inflicted, and the naming of that hurt, an admission of individual, organisational or collective responsibility for the hurt. As I said, it should come after truth as part of a broader process of accountability, and indeed apologies that are offered in the absence of truth are often play very, very badly with families. If you're trying to buy people off with an apology. There's a high-profile case at home of a human rights lawyer who was murdered by loyalist paramilitaries in collusion with the British state, and his wife and family have been campaigning for 30 years for an independent public inquiry into his death. And Cameron, having offered this a very good apology, brings over the Finucane family to set up a public inquiry, and they're flying from Belfast, and basically the deal has unravelled. The allegation is that the security services got to Cameron after the family had left Belfast Airport and before he gets to London, and so he offers an apology in lieu and an inquiry on the paperwork by Desmond de Silva, but in effect he's offering an apology in lieu, and so the victim's wife in this case says, how can you apologise for something when you won't tell me the truth of what you've done to me? You know, it's very powerful, and it's true. You know, so anyway, stress that. A statement of remorse or regret related to the wrongful act, a promise of non-recurrence. Obviously, if you continue to, if for example you apologise for police malfeasance or disorder or whatever, and then you do the same thing the next day, it's going to have less credibility with those affected. One of the interesting things about the Bloody Sunday apology is, and we've only discovered this in the interview in the families, is that Cameron's office reached out to the families beforehand to see what kind of wording would be useful. What did the families need to hear? And even culturally, you know, the differences between Irish people and British people, I think it was a sensible move for him. It doesn't mean they had a veto over what was going in the language, but they basically went back and said, well, you need to say this, you need to say, don't say that, whatever you do. And in fact, in the Bloody Sunday Museum in Derry, the Cameron's first draft of the apology is written by officials, and he's rewritten it and made it more generous himself, and it's handwritten notes. And the British civil servants involved have given the original to the Bloody Sunday Museum, which is run by the families. It's there in the Bloody Sunday Museum, so you can see where Cameron has made it more generous. You know, stroked out the kind of civil service language and actually made it more generous. Delivered with due respect and dignity. There was a lot of choreography in the Bloody Sunday thing. The families actually retraced the steps of the original march, and I think I had an image there. Let me see it. Maybe I didn't. Anyway, what the families did, so they all came out, and the first thing that they did was they tore up the Widgery report, like in the original whitewash public inquiry, and they came out and they symbolically tore it up, because that was the source of their anger, was the fact that their families had been blamed. And an apology needs to be made without reservation, qualification, or justification. So, again, transitional justice, I'll conclude on this, can be part of addressing the past, but you need bespoke solutions for each context, and certainly never adopting an off-the-shelf approach. And it needs to be underpinned by political will. It doesn't matter how clever your transitional justice mechanism or your commission of inquiry is. If the politics aren't right, it won't work. That's me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor McEvoy. I will invite Professor Maggy Lee from the University of Hong Kong to conclude our panel at this point.
Should I stay here? I don't have.
You can go wherever you like.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be a discussant today on the panel, and I will focus my comments on Tim's presentation, and then I'll allow more time for the audience to join in the discussion and offer you some time to perhaps respond to Kieran's excellent presentation. Let me start by saying that Tim's pioneering work exemplifies how social sciences can contribute to a more fully fledged understanding of civil disorders, socially significant social disorder, as in the case of the England case in 2011. And certainly Tim's work challenged our conventional thinking about civil unrest. And I'd like to pick up a couple of points from your talk, which offers us some pointers which I think form a very helpful basis for making sense of civil unrest in many societies, including Hong Kong. So my first brief observation relates to your final plea for social sciences to study civil unrest in the round. In other words, encouraging us as social scientists not only to study how civil unrest comes about, but also how it unfolds, how it mutates, how it diffuses, spreads, where it spreads, the types and numbers of people involved, their motivations, their rationalizations, the ways in which unrest is policed, managed, or responded to otherwise, and crucially, what occurs in the aftermath. And I fully agree with you, Tim, when you pointed out that there is a tendency for the authorities and some of us as social scientists to focus on the immediate triggering event as the beginning, as it were, of civil unrest. So, for example, in the 2011 case, the police shooting and the immediate community demonstration and confrontation with the police in Tottenham. And in our case, the anti-extradition bill and the mass confrontation with the police in Hong Kong back in June. And then followed that by focusing on the more visible signs of physical violence or looting or Occupy activities. And when those signs subside, which may take 4 days or 79 days or 7 months and counting, or years, as in the case of Northern Ireland, there's the temptation to see that as the end of the unrest. So it tends to be a rather neat and tidy way of looking at beginning and the end of civil unrest. So a lot of the ideas that you raised in your talk and really encourage us to rethink this notion of beginning and the end of the civil unrest, and to think through in a more nuanced way the context and the conditions of unrest. So you highlighted the more structural conditions in the England example, the historical poor relations between the police and young people in particular. So that's the context, and then the dynamics of the unrest, not just how it starts, but also how it unfolds and spreads, where it spreads, and so on. The nature of the unrest, the different forms of unrest, including different forms in the Hong Kong context, the singing, the human chain, at one end of the spectrum to the strikes and civil disobedience and more violent confrontations that we have in the Hong Kong context, how they are policed, and the recognition that policing intervention itself can both mitigate as well as exacerbate the unrest. There's nothing very radical or anti-establishment about that last point, really. is one of the foundational ideas in the sociology of policing, that we can only fully understand policing by looking at both the police and the policed, and the encounters between them in a micro level, whether we're talking about street-level policing or the more extraordinary examples of public order policing. And those ideas that we need to understand both the police and the policed and the encounters and the nature of the encounters, whether we're talking about the nature of order, the nature of order being imposed on the policed at the street level. We've just heard about the Northern Irish example. And those ideas are widely recognized in international police circles. So the aftermath, the final point about aftermath, all that happens as a consequence in terms of political responses, public responses, penal responses in terms of sentencing patterns, and public policy responses. And I think your suggestion that we need to take a more life cycle notion of unrest, understanding civil unrest in its full form, really encouraged us to down this path of a more nuanced understanding. My second brief observation relates to the inclusion of the perspectives and experiences of those involved in the unrest. And your study exemplifies the value of hearing directly from young people. Young people, of course, in Hong Kong tend to dominate in the unrest and in the arrest figures. So far, even though a wider age range is visible in public demonstrations. But often the challenge is, where are these voices when they seem to be everywhere? Through social media posts or through Lenin wall messages. And often the young people's voices are also captured by citizen journalists in a highly saturated information communications marketplace. So it's not necessarily straightforward for social scientists to identify the voices and understand systematically what the voices mean. The different models of collaboration, I believe, of hearing directly from young people. One of the more recent examples is the Stakeholders 2047 project with 100 volunteers reaching out to 100 young people and adults. So that's perhaps one form of collaboration and partnership between social scientists and, without necessarily having a principal investigator leading the funded project. So hearing directly from young people and how we make sense of those voices when those voices can be everywhere could be a challenge for social scientists. My two questions. The first one relates to civil unrest. Why doesn't civil unrest happen? So if we change the question, turn it around, instead of asking why civil unrest happens, why doesn't it happen in all locations? Why does it take place in some but not others which might share similar characteristics? Perhaps it's not just an empirical question which might relate to the relations between the police and the communities, but also perhaps it's a conceptual one. So are there conceptual tools that perhaps as social scientists we can offer so that we can think, look at civil unrest in a slightly different way and offer new ways for reading the riots or civil unrest? So why doesn't civil unrest happen all the time or in all localities? Why doesn't order break down in all civic spheres? And that's my first question. Second question relates to public policy response. We've heard from both Tim and Kieran that often there's willingness or unwillingness of the authorities to instigate a public inquiry, and sometimes public inquiries can lead to disappointments and mislearned lessons, as it were. In the UK, in the aftermath of the 2011 riots, we see a number of reviews, inquiries. For example, the Cross-Party Riots Communities and Victims Panel. There's the Home Affairs Select Committee examination of the policing. There's also the Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary review into policing deployment and training as well. Does the process matter as much as, or even more than, the outcomes or not? There's also the citizens' inquiry, which is much more ground level up, or bottom up, as it were, into the civil unrest, organized by and coordinated by the local communities, who continue to live with the consequences. So for an outsider looking at the inquiry, such as the citizens' inquiry, it seems that the process itself matters even more, because it seems very cathartic, allowing a lot of the anxieties and pain to be vented. So what is the worth of public inquiries? Here in the Hong Kong context, where we're fighting so hard to have an independent commission of inquiry. So what are your views on the process versus the outcome, the results, as it were?
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. I will ask Professor Newburn to join us up here before giving both Professor Newburn and Professor McEvoy an opportunity to respond. I thought what I would do is just some final comments as well to link up some of the ideas that have been that have surfaced along the way here. But one issue that I think in Professor McEvoy's talk didn't quite come out, and I'm going to raise it because it helps to sort of, I think, get us thinking about the context here in Hong Kong a little bit. And this is from a comparative perspective. So with respect to conflict scenarios of various kinds of intensity, when they are resolved in some way that seems to settle back into something resembling, let's call it peace, it seems to be very rare, if almost never the case, that one side decisively wins a complete victory and all of their preferences are realized, all of the demands are met. It seems to me, from the Northern Ireland case, but others as well, that oftentimes people end up having to accept something which is less than ideal from their perspective. And rather both sides, or several perspectives in a conflict, will have to accept a settlement that is a compromise that would involve some degree of horse trading. So just noting that. But then I think, going back to what Professor Chui was saying about radicalization, one of the things that seems to, if you want to say radicalize people involved in these sorts of things, is narratives of, or experiences of, sacrifice. And it makes it harder, I think, when people feel like others have given a lot to a cause, to accept a compromise, to accept something that's less than ideal. I mean, in Northern Ireland, this was part of the difficulty, I think, for many in accepting the Good Friday Agreement. There were those in the community there that said, well, this isn't what all of those people died for and did all those things for. This isn't what we meant or what we wanted. And so I think we, unfortunately, here in Hong Kong have had fatalities, casualties, and so on. Luckily not to the extent that occurred in Northern Ireland, but I think as these sorts of events, let's call them, accumulate, I worry that it actually makes it more difficult for us to come to some sort of compromise settlement here. So I would say I will be less cautious in my comments here, I suppose, in saying that there are some direct implications for this context here from the experience of these other places, things to watch out for. And one of those things to watch out for, I think, has already been noted, which Professor Newburn noted, is getting the police response wrong to a crisis can make things much worse. But another thing that Professor McEvoy noted as well is that getting the inquiry wrong can make things much worse. So it could be just sort of a falling on deaf ears, as in the Tottenham example, where something happens and so there was an official inquiry of sorts there, but it wasn't something that attracted any attention and had any legitimacy. And so I don't know if that did any harm, but it certainly didn't seem to do any good either. But I think, there's a danger that we could end up in this context with an inquiry and investigation that concludes, and it ends up being very much like the first Bloody Sunday inquiry. It ends up being itself another source of anger, of grievance. So that is a warning sign I would just point to. But then on a more optimistic note, I think that these experiences in some of these conflict societies, Northern Ireland included, that they do show that amazing changes are actually possible. Sometimes in going from a sense of hopelessness, suddenly there can be a shift where things, for whatever reason, start to move in a positive direction. And one of the things that I think seems to have changed quite drastically in the Northern Ireland context was the police culture, and a different organizational culture and approach to policing, which made a big positive difference, I would think. But then in the community, attitudes to the police, attitudes about the state, and a legitimacy crisis in Northern Ireland that actually, in many ways, for most people in that jurisdiction now, is, let's say, resolved, at least in a way that makes regular life more livable. So that's a little bit of an optimistic note. I will stop there. I will allow our colleagues to respond to my comments and Professor Lee's questions as well. If you want, maybe we'll start with Professor Newburn and your response to Professor Lee.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, it is. So thanks. Because there's quite a few points being made now. Maggy raised two questions. Maybe I'll start just by responding to the first one. And then the second one, which was about public policy responses and inquiries and so forth. Others will have views, and then maybe I'll come back on that. So rather than hog the microphone for too long. So the first question was why doesn't civil unrest happen? It's a nice, small, easy question to kick off with. Thank you very much. Yeah. So it invites a variety of responses, I think. So the first of which is what it really does is reinforce the point, which is why it does happen is not the interesting question, I think. Nor, I think, is it really an answerable question. Actually, I think we've probably wasted a lot of public money on social scientific research over the years trying to answer an unanswerable question. And actually, sociologically, the classical question is what makes public order, not disorder. And I think that a return to classical sociology is long overdue in that sense. So we would be much better off, really, thinking about Maggy's question. Maybe not in those terms, maybe not in why do riots not happen or why does civil unrest not happen, but what's the nature of public order and how is public order sustained? So what's the form of public order in whichever place we happen to find ourselves in, and how's that sustained? So what's the nature of civil society and government, constitution, and so forth? That's where they're really interested. But on a narrower level of why these things don't happen, I think then there are some interesting things to be said. So to take the England example, and I say England, because there were no riots in Wales, and there were no riots in Scotland, and I'll leave Northern Ireland out of this for the time being, but a place which is not unfamiliar with rioting, as we've seen, certainly wasn't part and parcel of that. So as I talked, I hoped to sort of create a picture of impoverished cities and marginalised communities and young, unhappy, disaffected and disenfranchised young people. Sure. They were in Haringey and in Brixton and indeed in Salford and in Liverpool and in Manchester and in Birmingham where the riots occurred. But they also were in Bristol and in Leeds and in Glasgow and you pick them where there weren't riots. So actually pointing to those things doesn't really help us explain very much. As I say, what I think it gets us to is the conditions out of which these things may occur. But the causes, as I think in that case, that just shows you, Maggy's question shows you the fruitlessness, really, of thinking about these things in etiological terms. But on a narrow scale, if one looks, if one takes examples, I'll finish with this, of cities in England which came during the 4 days of rioting, which came very close to large-scale unrest, but somehow just stepped back from the brink. In most cases, from my relatively limited research on this, but still some research on this, it appears to be the case that actually it was policing and civil society working jointly that enabled, as it were, the worst not to happen. So it was what people would call, neighbourhood or dialogue or communicative policing, aided and abetted by trusted members of civil society working together to calm a tense and dangerous situation down. So it was policing, as it were, policing with both a capital and a lowercase p, as it were, at its best. So in the narrow way, the answer to the question is that kind of social control, I think. On the bigger scale, yes, absolutely, we should be asking the question about orderliness.
Okay, I'll answer the two elements, I think, of Alex's question. The first one, you're absolutely right in terms of the sacrifice of people, martyrs and so forth, and that's a big issue in our conflict. So on all sides, the state, within loyalism and within republicanism, they all have people who have died for their respective causes. And so the compromises that were required for the peace process to take effect meant that had to be managed very, very carefully. And I think that the way in which it was, and it's kind of depressing as well if you do kind of political science or transitional justice work, because actually it came down, I think, a lot to individual leaders, the capacity of individual leaders to manage their own constituencies. And it's depressing at some level, because you think if Tony Blair is not in power with a large majority, if Bertie Ahern is not the leader in the Republic with a large majority, if Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness are not leading Sinn Féin, if the loyalist leaders like David Irving are not around, we were lucky in terms of that. There's no conflicts don't automatically end. Like, we were lucky. We had a generation of leaders who were able to get it over the line, manage their own constituencies, and in particular manage those kind of discourses about, is this what we fought for? Because there was always going to be a compromise. And so it really, for peace to be made, it requires effective leaders who have the skills to manage their own constituencies and make deals with others. Our government fell apart in Northern Ireland for 3 years there. And one of the reasons, in my view, is the irascibility of one of the leaders of one of the main parties, a very, very difficult person to get on with. It's just really difficult. And so actual individual agency makes a huge difference in terms of trying to resolve things and having leaders in place who can deliver their own constituencies and engage with others. The other thing, and this relates to your point about the cops and their role in all of this, there has been a fundamental change in policing. It was a key aspect of our peace process, because for many, particularly on the Republican nationalist side, they saw the police as an occupying force, essentially, in their communities. They were recruited, they were the armed wing of unionism for many Republicans and nationalists, and they had to change, basically. They had to change in terms of recruiting, but they had to change in the ways they went about their work, much bigger emphasis on the centrality of human rights, basically, in terms of the professionalisation of police. And in particular, so one of the things that I would say to cops in terms of another generation of young Irish nationalists, or Irish Republicans in particular, being radicalised, is don't do stupid stuff. Don't do stupid stuff, and what that means in particular is there's been an interesting transformation in policing discourses at home, whereby they've got really good at public order policing, much better than they used to be. So I'm heavily involved in the human rights movement, and so 20 years ago, whenever we would have deployed observers to see what the police were getting up to, and they were firing plastic bullets left, right and centre, and they were using all of the accoutrements of heavy policing of public order. And for people who we would call violence entrepreneurs, for people who want to radicalise young people, if that's the face of policing, then that you're doing their work for them. And what the cops have become really good at home is in terms of, we have an annual marching season that runs basically during the summer, where people from the Unionist Protestant Orange tradition march. And sometimes they march through Catholic areas where they're not wanted, and that creates riots. And so every year it was a mess. And what the police have become much more effective at is they negotiate with the actors. There's a lot of emphasis on negotiation and conflict resolution skills. And what they've done is, it's very clever, they've transformed the police culture away from, if you're a really good cop, that doesn't mean you do all the macho hard stuff. It's actually the soft skills. It's actually good, effective policing, resolving disputes. I was telling the guys, I was on a platform with the former Chief Constable a couple of years ago, and he shows a clip, basically, he stands up and he shows a clip of a riot situation in North Belfast associated with an Orange March. And it's just a zoo, it's just crazy. There's petrol bombs coming in, there's plastic bullets being fired by the police. It's a mess. And then he shows the same march 2 years later, and it's completely calm, and the police officers are walking up with the Orange men through the community, and there's one drum being beaten, and there's no mess. And he said, this one, option 2, that's effective policing. That took me and my team 6 months of negotiations to let that happen. And so making that part of the professional discourse of the cops, this is what good policing looks like. This is not good policing. This is not good professionalism. And that's been central, and then that feeds back into the peace process, because that stops another generation being radicalised by cops doing stupid stuff.
I think there may be some implications in what you said for this context. And I wonder, actually, if you'd like to follow up, Professor Chui, on the issue of radicalization, because you have a sort of, in a way, you paint a kind of potentially positive spin on it, but obviously it can go in ways that end up, let's say, heightening the level of tension in a place. Did you have a sense about from your interviews, was there a good and bad radicalization, I suppose, in a sense of, or a softer, harder kind of radicalization?
This is a very good question, and that's something that I would like to hear from the voices of the young people, especially those from the audience. And yes or no? Yes, in a way that I think you have mentioned about when we talk to the young people, that the group of people that is highly well educated, especially they are all from the universities in Hong Kong. And I can see that they are very determined. And what Tim has mentioned about they are angry. And I think the way that they are different from those people from Tottenham. I think the way why they are angry and they are disappointed and they are disaffected is total. I don't think it's the same as what we can imagine from the literature from the UK experience. Especially, you see, we've got a large group of university students. They are angry and in fact, one of the key questions we keep asking when they are choosing to become, let's say, they are daring enough to use violence at the expense of advancing the the goal, achieving the goal. And some of them, it's amazing. Some of them are indeed are very honest. They just say that they are not very rational at that point of time, because when they are it's quite emotional, and they choose to shift from the activism when we talk about they're using illegal means to moving to the illegal means. In fact, there are these conditions and the circumstances that explain so much why they make such a decision. And when we talk to them, when I ask them, after, especially right now, I'm dealing with a lot of students who have been arrested and they're on bail. Some are still on remand, and we hear a lot of voices. In fact, very diverse, and somehow to a point that I agree with him. So, this social science research, is it able to capture all the varied experiences of the young people? So I paint a very dim view on that, because especially when we ask about our students, what is the way to move forward, even to manage the university. And there are very diverse views, especially even within our sample. We've got local and non-local students, and we've got students who are doing the social sciences versus, scientific subjects, science majors. They are very, very different. So that's the reason why it's so hard to capture. But I want to conclude in a way that I still think that it's very, learning from the experiences from England and Northern Ireland, and still peace will be restored one day, I think, so long as, we are committed to work on that. But of course, we are yet to see, when. So, but while I'm still very optimistic about the future, still it seems that steps are rather patchy and slow in order to achieve what has been done in the UK and Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the issues is that we don't seem to have a coherent plan to take shape for what happens next. Okay, we have time for 3 questions from the audience before I have to close this panel. And I'll take Margaret, if you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank our visitors for their presentations today. And I hope that their presentation will give this university and all the universities in Hong Kong the greater incentive to step in to do this kind of study. I want to respond to Professor Newburn. I have reading the riots many times because there are voices in this community to want to replicate the study that you did, not on the present protests, but on the one before that, in 2016, which was a smaller matter. Now, the difficulties encountered is enormous, and this is not the time to go into it. But I think that the study that you have led was something that this place with our universities could have tried. And it is amazing that it wasn't. At least I know that some people are doing it, especially when this government said that they will not do an independent inquiry. There is a lot of voices in the community to say, well, then let civil society do one. And the difficulties we encounter. Now, I want to talk about the price that this community has to pay because the studies were not done. Because what you see today in the riots, so-called, in the last year, had a history. It was because in 2016, at the end of it, when there was a very strong civil unrest, there was a clash. The government, the Legislative Council, refused to study it. And so all the frustration, the anger, the hostility festered, which led to the event in 2016. And that event was not studied. Again, a refusal to study it led to the greater antagonism and frustration which you saw last year. And I think this is a matter that this community, people sitting in this hall now, should take up. I also want to respond to Professor McEvoy in that I fully agree that when we are now looking at independent inquiry, without a political will, without the correct political will behind it, this is all not going to work. And the Hong Kong's basic difficulty is that we don't know where this political will is going to come from. The demand from the community is much, much stronger than the incentive from the government. And so we are now here to study how we can overcome that, how in spite of that, because truth is important. People don't only want bad police officers to be punished. They don't only want to vindicate themselves. They want the truth to be told, because truth is more than half of justice. And I also wonder why, with so many studies going on about policing in the United Kingdom and in America, I'm told, I know less about America, there is so little study of policing in Hong Kong. This is what we needed. I'm told that the first suggestion, proposal, or lesson of policing unrest came from Hong Kong in the 1967 riots. And since then, the UK had changed its policy of policing many times. Why are we not doing it here? The situation here is different. Different from what Professor Newburn said. It has not been a sort of underprivileged class who has an ongoing hostile relationship with the police. It was that on the 12th of June, the Hong Kong community was shocked that our police could be so brutal. The people who took to what Professor Chui said as radical action, that is, people resort to violence, were not underprivileged people. Many of them are from the universities, many have very good jobs, and that was a response to the brutal policing that they are seeing in the streets. So there are too many questions, and I don't want to take even more time. The thing I want is just to thank the visitors for coming, and I hope that this will continue so that you will start the trend in our community, in our university, to study these very, very important matters. Thank you.
I think that deserves a question. So we can take one more question quickly, and I'm told actually that we have to move along from the podium or from the panel shortly. So please, we'll have a brief question and some brief responses.
Very short question for Professor McEvoy. You said that when the politics wasn't right, even with a decent inquiry wouldn't work, even with amnesty wouldn't work. So my question for you is, would you see that the longer process, the longer peace process, ultimately it is this alternative, or how should I say, a non-violent path towards an alternative constitutional future for Northern Ireland, namely through the principle of consent, that reunification of Ireland can be achieved, that actually help politics, move forward? Would you say something on that? Thank you.
Yes, please, Professor Newburn and Professor McEvoy.
So I'll try and be quick. Thank you very much for the overly generous but the very kind comments. It's hugely appreciated. It links, I think, the things that you were saying about the research links with Maggy's second question, which I didn't answer, but about inquiries and points that both Kieran and Alex were making about those. In a circumstance where, and this would be true here, and was the case, despite the sort of the various inquiries we did have, there was nothing of stature and substance and legitimacy. And in the absence of those, then I think research does have a role to play and can do things. And I wouldn't suggest for a moment that the way that we did our study is necessarily either easy or a model for doing these things. But except that, I think Eric and I were talking about this before the session started. One of the things that I think is very interesting about Unrest is that one of the bits of potential that it has, I think, is to disrupt research, not just disrupt civil life, as it were. And it can create a space, if one is fortunate, in which those of us who do these kinds of jobs potentially have, as it were, opportunity and permission to do things a little differently. It's sort of take the shackles off research, not to worry quite so much about methodological purity and so forth, but actually really to do a piece to do something pragmatic and quick, and essentially there to get out, and it might be the 100 people type study. But there's all sorts of possibilities, I think, of allowing people to testify, to giving them a voice in some kind of way, and that's a very rich thing for social science, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And a few years ago, I did an edited collection called Transitional Justice from Below, and essentially looking at precisely this in a context where if you have a reluctant state to engage, then what can communities themselves and civil society do themselves? And certainly in the Northern Ireland context, before we had an engagement at the macro political level, there were lots of really interesting examples of community-based truth recovery, essentially, and often involving academics who had the technical skills to help the community to establish these things. And it can be very empowering, I think, actually, for communities. Now, it can be also difficult as well, because often truth can be uncomfortable. You know, truth can you may find out things about your community or your experience of violence. For example, I know in some instances people who thought that their loved ones were killed by loyalists by the other side, then they find out actually in this one particular Truth Our Down commemoration project, it's called, it was one project where they did this, you find out actually your father was killed by your own side and for an alleged informer. So truth can be very destabilizing within communities. It's not an easy thing, but nonetheless, in contexts where states are unwilling to engage, certainly in the Irish context, in Colombia and South Africa and various other places, people have done it themselves and engaged, and it definitely can be done. In terms of your question, Martin, on the broader political point, yeah, I think what happened essentially is that certainly within the leadership of Irish republicanism, they came to a rational calculation that they could achieve more through unarmed struggle than they could achieve via the armed struggle. They had got to a stage where technically they had become as good at terrorism as you can get, but without being able to tilt the axis with the British. And I think they'd realised that the price that was being paid, it was a rational calculation. It wasn't a moral abandonment of violence, but it was a rational calculation that they could achieve their ends through unarmed struggle, as they would call it, i.e. engagement in politics, rather than through the armed struggle, and that's what happened. Of course, they didn't realise what their secret weapon was for achieving United Ireland was actually the stupidity of English Tories and Brexit. So basically, Brexit has done all the work for them, which is why we are now having a really grown-up conversation. So that I was telling the guys yesterday, I had a discussion with a senior former IRA commander, and I said, isn't there a real irony, like you lot blew this place up for years, for 30 years, and the secret weapon was actually English Tories. English nationalism was the secret weapon in delivering United Ireland, like so.
Thank you, Kieran, for ending on a good comedic note. So please join me in thanking our panel and our guests for coming from so far away. Thank you very much.